So thank you for joining the first webinar in the LORTA virtual design workshop. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening. We're delighted to welcome you to this event, and we're thrilled that we're being joined by almost 70 participants from over 16 GCF projects. Climate change is all about adjusting to new circumstances, and everyone attending the webinar now and all of their colleagues, friends and families have also had to adjust to new circumstances. The reality of the COVID-19 pandemic and the importance of social distancing. Our LORTA design seminar has also had to adjust to this new reality, and we've moved to a virtual environment. But before I start and outline today's agenda, allow me to introduce the colleagues from GCF IU, C4ED, and other partners and stakeholders who will be supporting all of us through this 8-part webinar workshop series. Firstly, the colleagues from the GCF's Independent Evaluation Unit, led by Dr. Jyotsna Puri, head of the IU. Joe, who is here, created LORTA almost 3 years ago and has managed the program very successfully. Since then, along with Dr. Solomon Asfow, Principal Evaluation Officer of the IU. We're also joined by numerous further colleagues from the IU, such as Victoria Khan, Emil Khan, as well as many others illustrated here. And we welcome you to the workshop and to this webinar. In LORTA, the IU works with C4ED from Mannheim, Germany. In particular, Dr. Markus Frohlich, Dr. Susan Steiner, and Ms. Elisabeth Dorfmeister, all of whom have worked on LORTA for a number of years. In addition, we're joined by other stakeholders. First, colleagues from the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, and also by a key private sector accredited entity in the GCF, Acumen. As I've already mentioned, we're absolutely thrilled that 16 GCF projects have registered for the workshop. We have projects from a wide variety of sources, wide variety of countries, and from both public and private sectors. This year, we have 7 projects from the Simplified Approval Process program, including from Namibia, Bangladesh, and from the Philippines. And I'd like to encourage you all to participate as much as possible during this webinar. So during the reading session and the question and answer session, please post all of your questions in the chat box, and we'll do our very, very best to answer them. So today's agenda is as follows. The webinar is covering 2 topics. What is LORTA and why is it important? So initially, I'll go through a short number of slides based on Dr. Puri's excellent video, which covered the background to LORTA and the reasons why LORTA exists. After this short slide summary, our colleague Julia from C4ED will go over 2 readings very briefly. We will then answer questions on these readings. That is both Julia and I. And following this, we will turn to a quiz. The quiz will be held in Mentimeter, and you'll receive an access code for that quiz. And this is a will offer a light-hearted and interactive way to learn about LORTA. We then have a 5-minute break. When we come back from the break, there'll be a question and answer session. So this will be moderated by Julia and I. And following that, we have the most important part of today's webinar. So this is the introduction of technical assistance teams for the breakout sessions. So for the last 30 minutes of the webinar, all participants will be allocated to one of 8 breakout groups. And within the breakout group, you'll be introduced to each other, including to another project team, as well as to the C4AD impact evaluation specialist who will be supporting you, as well as IU support staff. So the main aim in the breakout groups, is for you to introduce yourselves and to agree upon the timing and the platform for your 7 breakout sessions. So those 30 minutes are important, and a chance for you to agree on when you'll be meeting with each other in your breakout groups and how you'll be meeting with each other. And then finally, immediately after the seminar, participants are going to receive the video for webinar 2, the readings, and relevant material. So just before we start, I need to let you know that this talk is being recorded and will be available after the webinar. So to the first set of slides. What is LORTA and why is it important? Well, we're all linked to LORTA through GCF projects, through different GCF projects. And we all share a commitment to supporting the GCF to achieve its goals. But to what extent are we able to attribute impacts in the project locations to your specific project? So we need to know not only whether the program caused the change, but we also need to be able to justify that the change wouldn't have happened anyway. So we also need to know if the program did cause the change, what was the size of that change? And why do we need to know this? Well, we need to know this because perhaps there are other cheaper ways to create the same change. And this slide you'll recognize, this is taken from, if we just go back, yeah, that's it. So you'll recognize this slide. This slide is taken from Joe's video presentation that introduces LORTA, and I hope that many of you have had the opportunity to see. So we're measuring change, and we need to know how much change has occurred, and we do that because we need to find out which interventions are giving GCF the greatest bang, if you like, for each dollar. So overall, we aim to help GCF stakeholders to measure impacts for beneficiaries overall, and also subgroups of those beneficiaries. So how do we do that? How do we measure this impact? Well, we do that through counterfactual methods. You'll recognize this slide as well. This is also from Joe's video. We compare the project with what would have happened if the project didn't exist. So we build into the project an impact evaluation right from the very start. And we do this by using a counterfactual comparison group, either through random assignment of project interventions or by mimicking a comparison group, a quasi-experiment. And all of this is based on an accurate theory of change. And when do we do that? Well, we do it throughout the project cycle. You'll also recognize this slide. This slide is also one of Jo's slides from her video. And it shows that we measure implementation fidelity, so delivery, uptake, and use. We measure outputs within the first 1 to 3 years, such as participation in the program. We measure outcomes between 3 and 5 years, such as changed agricultural practices and changes in yields, and also impacts from 5 to 10 years, such as improved asset holdings, entitlements, and resilience. So overall, the objectives of the LORTA design program and workshop are to help you embed real-time and causal counterfactual-based measurements. Through the workshop, projects are chosen for technical assistance for the duration of their timelines. A further objective of the design workshop is to understand the extent of commitment to measurement by project staff, and overall, to build a partnership and to start the journey. So thank you for your attention for the first 10 minutes of the webinar. With that, I'm going to hand over to the second part of today's agenda, and that's a discussion of 2 readings by Julia Montresso. Over to you, Julia.
Yes, thank you very much, Martin. I am an impact evaluation specialist at the Center for Evaluation and Development, and I am pleased to present to you the 2 readings selected for today. Next. The first reading selected is an article by Jo Puri and other colleagues, including Martin from the IU, that is about the challenges to measuring the causal impact of the GCF investments and the scope of the LORTA program. In the first part, the article summarizes challenges to the measuring of the impact of the GCF investments. The first challenge that is mentioned is the fact that GCF has a very heterogeneous portfolio of projects in mitigation and adaptation, such that each project has multiple objectives and also multiple subcomponents. Therefore, each of them can be defined as a complex system, so that it is difficult to disentangle causal pathways within these complex structures. The second challenge that is mentioned is the ownership requirement. As you know, GCF requires that projects are country-led, and this in practice means that there will be a setup of multiple agreements among many stakeholders, and this relates also to the production, use, analysis, and release of the data and findings for evaluation as well. The third challenge is the measurement and the reporting requirements for credible evaluations. And for example, in this respect, there was a review from IU in 2018 that identified that these key requirements were often not included into the systems and processes of GCF. So for example, there were no clear guidelines for the definition of indicators to project applicants, funding applicants. Challenge number 4 is that there was an identification of some quality issues at entry of the GCF investment proposals, and whereby quality here we strictly refer to project proposals and to be appropriately set for impact measurement. And so, for example, in 2019, IU identified that among all the proposals that were submitted for funding, only 20% of them included a well-defined tier of change. Only 10% of them had sound plans to collect data of sufficient quality. So we can move to the next slide. The second part of the article introduces the scope of LORTA and especially the what and the hows. So what does LORTA do? Martin has already introduced to you, and that LORTA is focused on measuring the causal impact of the GCF investments using theory-based impact evaluation methods. LORTA fosters to have well-planned data collections and produce high-quality data for the beneficiary population, but also for comparison populations that are used as a benchmark against which to measure the progress and the results for the target population, so for the beneficiaries, and therefore the impact of the project. LORTA also supports independent data system and analysis for credible impact measurement. And how? First of all, by creating awareness and capacity on impact evaluation, by a close interaction with the country project teams, then requiring the buy-in from the project teams of the overall idea of impact evaluation, and ask them to try to consider impact evaluation methods within their costs, timing, and capacity. Also trying to identify champions among accredited entities that can be interested in visibility in impact measurement and then can advocate for impact evaluations. And finally, using the design workshops to provide customized trainings and select LORTA projects for direct support within LORTA. Next. We can then move to the next reading of today, which is a briefing note from FAO that advocates for the use of impact evaluation methods to improve policymaking for climate change adaptation in agriculture. The takeaway of this briefing note is that the use of impact evaluation methods can help policymakers in the formulation of the national adaptation plans in agriculture. The two main questions are when and how. From the start, from the preparatory phase of national adaptation plans, impact evaluation methods can help to rigorously assess adaptation options and understand which options can work best, for example, to address the needs of farmers in making them more resilient to climate change. Next, in the implementation strategy stage, so at the actual level when the national planning is being defined, those adaptation options that resulted to be most effective then can be prioritized among others. And finally, in the reporting, monitoring, and review stage, as climate continues to change, of course, there's the need to continuously adapt and review also the national adaptation plan in a continuous process of testing, learning, and prioritizing. Next. In this briefing note, there's also a case study, and the case study is about a program that was carried out in Odisha, India. And it was a program trying to address the needs of farmers and make them more resilient against the risk of floods. Because of climate change, these farmers became more and more vulnerable to the risk of floods, and this was associated with the low use of land and investments. Then the program offered farmers to adopt some innovation. This innovation is the use of a new variety of rice, which is flood resilient. This impact evaluation was this program was evaluated with a impact evaluation method that is called randomized control trial. And as the briefing note also explains to you, there are many other methods, but this one is the preferred method as it provides the most reliable measure of impact when it is most reliable measure of impact. And so it is most preferred when it is actually feasible to be implemented. It is called randomized essentially because among the overall population of vulnerable farmers to the risk of floods, the farmers that are selected for the program are simply randomly selected. So the random location creates two groups, the group of beneficiary farmers that gets the seeds and so participate into the program, and the group of non-beneficiary farmers, also called sometimes control group or comparison group, that does not participate into the program. So here the measure of the impact of the program is given by the difference in outcomes that is observed between the beneficiary group and the control group, the comparison group. What are the impacts that were observed with this evaluation is that the beneficiary farmers, as opposed to non-beneficiary farmers, had increased investments in their land. They had higher profitability, and also they reduced losses due to flooding. Because of this, the use of these flood resilient seeds was then considered an activity to be scaled up also to other regions, and then it was considered a candidate option to be included as a priority in the National Adaptation Plan. Next. Yeah, so we have arrived to the end of the reading presentation. We can start the discussion. Any discussion point is very welcomed. I here simply listed a number of questions for your consideration.
So thank you very much, Julia, for the summary. And I'll read through the suggested points for discussion, and participants are encouraged to list their questions in the chat box, and Julia and I will do our best to respond. So what challenges to impact measurement do you anticipate? Are there any challenges you'd like to share based on experience from past projects? What benefits do you expect to see from LORTA? What methods are you currently using for assessing results of the implementation of your projects? And how do you see the process of integrating impact measurements into policymaking? So we'd welcome your questions in the chat box at precisely this moment. Thank you very much. AKM Naruzaman. How do we find an appropriate counterfactual to compare? I think this is a great question, and there are numerous ways that LORTA does this. Julia, would you like to come in to start with, and then I'll follow up?
Yes. So we can maybe go back to the last slide. So as an example, there was this program about farmers vulnerable to the risk of floods. So in this case, the conditions were such that it was possible to have particular impact evaluation methods. Depending on the conditions and the situation at baseline, we can adopt different methods. Also, but in this case, it was possible to have identified first eligible population. By the eligible population, we mean that we talk about, in this case, farmers that are vulnerable to floods. And then among them, it was possible to actually run a lottery. And thereby, you automatically generate a comparison group. So in this sense, the two groups of farmers are identical in characteristics. The only difference between them is that one of them does not participate into the group. So this is one way to create a comparison group. Some other times it is not possible for ethical reason or other conditions to randomize. Then we have to rely on some assumptions that maybe will be explained in the next sessions. But essentially the comparison group is a group of non-beneficiaries that has to replicate in characteristics the beneficiary group.
Thank you, Julia. And just to reiterate, now the last of those points, if random assignment of the intervention isn't possible, which it may well not be, then quasi-experimental methods can recreate a comparison group through, for example, propensity score matching or other approaches, which we'll cover in some detail in this workshop. So So we'll cover two more questions quickly before moving on to the quiz. So we'll take Prudencio's question first and then Daniel's question. So Prudencio asks, is the project's logical framework good enough to operationalize in LORTA? I think this is a really good question, and I'll take this quickly, Julia. The logical framework is certainly a good starting point, but as we'll cover in the workshop, the project's theory of change is often a more appropriate point of entry for an impact evaluation. And as we'll cover in the next session, the nodes of a theory of change lead to the generation of key evaluation questions, but importantly, the links between the nodes of a theory of change highlight particular assumptions, which can also be investigated through an impact evaluation. So is the project's logical framework good enough? It's a great starting point. Is the project's theory of change perhaps a better starting point? Yes, probably. Julia, would you like to add to that?
No, that perfectly covered the point.
Okay, and then the last question we'll cover at this point is from Daniel. Daniel says, how about initial challenges regarding the lack of reliable baseline data? How do we go about filling this gap? Would you like to come in on this point, Julia?
Sorry, I didn't hear you. So what about the lack of baseline data?
Yeah, so an initial challenge is the lack of reliable baseline data. How can we go around filling this gap?
Yeah, so when baseline data is not available, first of all, are we talking about primary data? So sometimes it is possible to retrieve secondary data. So for example, from census or from other databases. And other times, if no data is available, we can rely on ex post methods. For example, when you apply matching, we can also use an ex post evaluation. Of course, when we start using ex post evaluation, then we have to rely on more and more assumptions.
So thank you for that, Julia, and thank you also to Ben and Anya and Gwedeth and Pabe for their questions. We're going to move on to the next section of today's webinar, and we'll do our best to get back to you on the questions you've posted in the question and answer session just after the break. So thank you for posting them. So we'll now move on to a short quiz. So please go to mentimeter.com, and the passcode for this Menti quiz is 2846199. So before we have a 5-minute break, we encourage you to go to www.menti.com and to fill in the passcode, which is in the chat box. So the passcode is 2846199. And we're going to wait a short time to see how many participants we have. So far, we have 12 participants in the room, in the quiz room, and we have 72 participants in the webinar. So we're going to wait until perhaps we get up to 40 or 50 participants, and then we'll start the quiz. We're up to around 20 participants now, so we'll still wait perhaps 30 seconds or a minute until a few more people log into the quiz. So once again, we encourage you on any device to go to www.menti.com and to use the passcode 2846199 to enter the quiz. And we now have 30 participants in the quiz, which is fantastic. And we're just going to wait for 10 more participants to get up to 40, and then we'll start this activity. Okay, so we're almost there now. We've got 36. So I'm just encourage you one more time to go to www.menti.com and to fill in the passcode of 2846199 and participate in this quiz. Okay, 39 participants. So we just need 2 more participants and then we'll start. Okay, we're there. Let's start. So, question 1. Currently, how many projects, including both 2018 and 2019, are part of the LORTA portfolio? 11, 13, 12, or 14? So there are 13 projects in the LORTA portfolio, and of those 13, there are 12 active projects. 1 project from the Democratic Republic of Congo will hopefully come on board next year. On to question 2. The structure of the LORTA program is comprised in how many phases? The correct answer is 4. Phase 0, the design workshop that you're participating in now. Phase 1, formative engagement and design. Phase 2, impact assessment. Phase 3, data analysis and feedback. So on to question 3. Which of the following is not an impact evaluation methodology? And you're right. None of the above. So an RCT controls for confounding factors by randomly assigning the intervention to treatment and comparison groups. And the other methods here imitate or replicate this gold standard in different ways. And we'll cover this and more methods as we go through the course. So on your device, you can see what place you are in. And here I can turn to the leaderboard and I can see that Palermo is in first place, Puggy is in second place, and Frank is in third place. So it's close at the top, put it that way. On to question 4. So what are the objectives of the LORTA program? The objective of the LORTA program is real-time and causal counterfactual based measurement and to ensure that this is embedded in funded programs and projects. Question 5. So what does LORTA stand for? Learning orientated real-time impact assessment. Okay, 2 more questions left, and then we'll take a break. Question 6. Where was the very first LORTA design workshop held? That's correct. It was held in Bangkok, in Thailand. And question 7. Which of the following statements is not correct? That's correct. The incorrect statement is that LRCTs are random. So turning to the leaderboard at the end, we can see that the participant with the highest score, or the 3rd highest score, is Wolfmeister. The 2nd highest score is Frank, and the highest score is Puggy. So congratulations to Puggy. Perhaps Puggy could reveal themselves in the chat box. Perhaps or perhaps not.
You should count Puggy because that's me. So I should not be counted.
Congratulations. 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 That's fantastic. So I hope you enjoyed the quiz as much as we did. And with that, we're going to move to the next activity, which is a 5-minute break. So thank you for your participation for the first 45 minutes, and we'll be back shortly in 5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you for rejoining us for the second half of the webinar. We're just moving into the 4th section of the webinar, and this is the question and answer session. So we'll start running through the questions that have been posted in the chat box, and along with my colleague Julia and I will do our best to answer any questions that are in the chat box. So we'll start with the question posed by Gwyneth from SAP Project 12. How can we attribute results and impacts to GCF investments, for instance, for projects focused on agriculture and natural resource management, when so many actors, policies, interventions, donors and sectors are involved? So I'd like to hand over to Julia and ask her to respond to this question. Oh.
Hello? Yeah. So I think this is where theory change is very important here. It is very important to have very well in mind who is the target population and who will receive what from the program. It is very important if there is an overlap in intervention to understand which farmers, for example, get the seeds, which farmers get the seeds and additional services, for example, trainings. It is important to define the comparison group. The comparison group, as we said already, has to replicate in characteristics the beneficiary group. So if the intervention is, for example, receiving seeds, it is important that we have non-beneficiary farmer that is similar but does not receive seeds. Yeah, but so that's basically the idea. You need to find another group of farmers that is similar, that maybe receive the same group of interventions, maybe not just, it can be also multiple interventions, not just receiving seeds, but we need to have some difference. The non-beneficiary need to receive something less or nothing. I don't know if that was clear, otherwise I will try to repeat with some other example.
Yeah, I think it was clear, Julia. And just to say that through random assignment, for example, there a lot of confounding factors are controlled for. There may be some contamination from a different project in the same region. So in that sense, it may be important to spread out or to have a dispersed intervention area. But through random assignments, all of these confounding factors should be controlled for. Turning to the question from Ben Vickers, monitoring the counterfactual groups will increase costs to the project quite substantially. How do we incorporate these increased costs into project budgets after projects have already been approved? This is a very good question. Julia, would you like to take this?
Yeah, so yes. So of course there's, we have to look at costs and benefits. If you don't follow the non-beneficiary population, then you will not be able to establish causality. So you will not be able to give a reliable estimate of the effect of the program. And we know that this is important in order to show evidence to donors or new funding. For example, if you want to later not only test if the program is effective, but if it is actually effective, then you could scale it up, for example, receive more funding, and also share learning with the rest of the field. So this is one benefit that should be considered. In respect to costs, of course, then there's another discussion that is left for the GCF system and processes with the GCF proposals.
Absolutely, Julia. And you highlight a really important point in the sense that LORTA provides technical support through C4ED at the moment. So this is a support of impact specialists, impact evaluation specialists. And that technical support, encourages the implementation of an impact evaluation design, but that doesn't necessarily mean that increased resources will be available for within the project envelope. So I think Ben's question is very, very valid and is well taken. We'll turn to the third question from
Martin. May I come in here?
Absolutely, please do, Jo.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. I think what is really important to recognize is that LORTA is a program that is implemented with the ownership and the leadership, of course, of the accredited entity and the projects on the ground. But we also work, the IEO works very closely also with our secretariat colleagues. Then once projects have been selected, so we're really privileged to have all 16 of you, of course, attending these webinars. As you work with the technical assistance teams over the next 8 weeks, essentially, what we will be doing is working very closely, the C4ED and the IU teams will be working very closely with each one of the teams to figure out as to what the potentials are for high quality impact assessment work. And this will include both an assessment of not just the extent to which there is capacity within the team, and I know that there is one other question associated with it, but also the extent to which there is openness to learning some additional techniques, both on measurement as well as setting up counterfactuals. Alongside that, we also start to, once we, so not all 16 will go into becoming LORTA projects, as you know. This is not possible mainly because one, we understand that we've done a preliminary assessment, but it is really important for the project to also show ownership and to show leadership in that they are committed to doing a lot of the measurement, because finally, this is a co-owned, co-implemented program. So that means that there will have to be leadership and ownership on the ground by the project and by the accredited entity. But for the projects that we do end up selecting and that become part of LORTA, in 2020 and then subsequently, essentially we work very closely with the teams as well as with the GCS Secretariat to provide some of the assistance. And the IEU has small amounts of budget that we can use to provide that technical assistance, although the assistance cannot go directly because of procurement reasons, directly to the project. So we can help through competitive procurement processes to help you bring on board additional measurement expertise. We can also get C4ED to work with you, that we pay for, that we cover the costs of, to help you work through this data collection and data analysis work, but with a very important set of caveats. One, that it has to be, that this has to be owned and led by all of us jointly. So it is not just an IEU LORTA project, it is the AE and the project units LORTA project. Second, that there has to be commitment to high quality measurement by the team, as well as by all of us around. And third, that there is then a commitment to also seeing as to how we can work both with contingency budgets that are usually available within the LORTA, within the project budgets, but also a commitment from our side to then try and work with Secretariat as well as within our own budgets to see as to how we can support the additional requirements that may come up for additional data that is required for measurement. So we are expecting that at least most of the projects will have some provision already for baseline data collection, for example, within the project area. We understand that for counterfactual areas and for additional monitoring, there will be additional resources that are required. We'll work with you to try to figure out as to which one of the sources or a multitude of sources we can bring on board so that we can help to do this measurement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that clarification. So we've got time to answer a couple more of the questions that have been posted in the chat box. And the first question we can turn to is a question from SAP 12, Pathe. So this was in reference to the program management unit capacity and the availability of a strong M&E specialist to collect data and process. A great project design with a weak team will lead to lower impact, while a not well-designed project with a strong team will lead to great impact. How can impact evaluation look at these fundamental issues? Julia, Joe, do you want to come in on this?
Julia first, and then I can.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so here we are talking about capacity building, and this is one of the major point of LORTA, right? Providing capacity building for impact evaluation. As Joe said, we are here to provide quality assurance throughout the whole life of the project, if it is selected within LORTA. And then, yes, so there is a problem if there's not enough capacity for that. But even if there is capacity, even if there's a weak design, there's a strong team, and then we have great impact, yes, but impact needs to be measured. So we need to have data for that. We need to have evidence for that. So there is the need to use methods. And so we need to combine that with impact evaluation.
Thank you, Julia. Joe, would you like to come in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pate. So I think first, I think we need to point out that a project that does not have that is not well designed or well implemented, but has a strong team, will not lead to greater impact. The definition of what we mean by a strong team is that they have the wherewithal in terms of their technical capacity, but also that the team itself has the ability to, has planned for and has the ability to collect good data. So I think the second part of that statement, while it sounds attractive, is not true. The first part is definitely, you're right, that you may have a very strong project, well designed, well implemented, but if you don't have a strong, that if you have a weak M&E team, you're not going to be able to pick up the impact. And that's exactly why LORTA is here. We are committed to ensuring that that weakness in the team that you may identify, we can help you mitigate that weakness, because we do feel that it is important for the GCF, but also for the accredited entity to come in a strong way and to be able to pick up the impact, but also, even if it's not a strong impact, the idea is to build that capacity, like Julia said, and to essentially make for a stronger team, so that it's not just this project that you're learning from in a continuous way. This helps basically the team and the entity subsequently as well. So it has long-term consequences as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. So there are 3 further questions, and I'm going to group these questions together. So from FP 101, we've got Solis Lorne. So for a project that has a relatively small target population size where randomization may not be possible and vulnerabilities across regions in the target area different, what quasi-experimental method would be useful? Anya from SAPO 6 asks, establishment of a control group has been a challenge because for some farmers who didn't benefit from the project feel excluded, and so cooperation is limited. And from FP 113, Francis asks, during project implementation, suppose some members of the control group decide to participate in the intervention. Should they be dropped from the control group, or what happens? Now, these are exactly the questions you need to be discussing with your impact evaluation specialists in the breakout groups. These are precisely the detailed questions that the breakout groups have been designed for, and it's that part of today's agenda that we're going to move towards. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So we're now going to be moving to the introduction of technical assistant teams for the breakout sessions. So at this point, you're going to be allocated to one of 8 breakout groups, and you'll have received this information in the workshop manual that was distributed previously. Within each of these breakout groups, you'll introduce yourselves and also meet the impact evaluation specialist who will be supporting your project through this virtual design workshop. So for example, next slide, please. So for example, in group 1, FP 48 and FP 101 will be supported by Nathan. In group 2, FP 76 and FP 116 will be supported by Katerina. In group 3, FP 110 and FP 111 will be supported by Asmus and Emil. In group 4, FP 113 and SAP 06 will be supported by Asmus. Moving on, in group 5, FP 118 and SAP 07 will be supported by Esther. In group 6, FP 121 and SAP 05 will be supported by Clementine today. In group 7, SAP 08 and SAP 10 will be supported by Mark and Julia. And in group 8, SAP 11 and SAP 12 will be supported by Nicholas and I. So you'll now receive a breakout invite, a breakout room invite. So please accept that invite, and we will reconvene in plenary in just over 20 minutes. So we've all reassembled back in plenary again, and we've come to the end of this first webinar for this virtual design workshop for LORTA. I hope that you, and I trust you, had a very productive breakout group in meeting the impact evaluation specialist who will be supporting you, and we very much appreciate your attendance and continued participation. And on that note, I'd like to thank you all for taking part this evening, and look forward to meeting you again the same time next week for webinar 2. Immediately after this webinar, you'll be receiving an email which will contain the link to the second video, which will be on theories of change. And on the last slide of that video, you'll be able to download the relevant reading material, which we encourage you to read prior to your breakout group, which leaves some of us of quite a short amount of time. We just arranged in breakout group 8 to meet tomorrow, so this means additional reading between now and tomorrow. But we very much hope that you enjoy the breakout groups as well. And on that note, I'd like to thank all of our colleagues from Acumen, from Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, for the Center for Evaluation and Development in Mannheim in Germany, and especially for all of the project participants from 16 GCF projects for joining us today, and really looking forward to a very invigorating and exciting 7 weeks of this design workshop. So thank you again, and we'll speak to you all very soon.